Good day, Internet. This is Chavez and Valko, your full immigration law firm. We're here today to talk about another non-immigrant visa category. Top for today is going to be the P visa. My name is Ben Hamilton. I'm a senior associate here at Chavez and Valko. 10 years experience working in employment-based immigration law. Here with me is Associate Attorney Andrew Craven. Andrew, how's it going today?
Going good, Ben. How are you?
Doing well. Excited to talk about the P visa, which is maybe a lesser known, a little more nuanced uh visa than we've talked about before. Andrew, how you feeling today about the P?
Feeling good. I mean, it's definitely not one that we do as common as, like H-1Bs where it's all the time. The P is very specifically, this niche group, so it's mostly athletes and entertainment groups.
Well, let's jump into it right then, right? So you kind of laid out the basics there. It's mostly directed at athletes and entertainers. But there's a couple different Ps. So what are the types of P visas that we have?
So you get three kinds. So there's the P1, which is for athletes, entertainment groups. Then there's the P2, which is for reciprocal exchange entertainment groups. And then finally the P3 for groups that will provide a culturally unique performance.
So before we kind of break those down individually, we're going to kind of jump into some of the basics that kind of apply to all Ps across the board, right? So the first of those is a discussion of, the competition, performance, or event. That's something that's you have to be able to discuss related to all Ps. So what is the purpose of a P?
Well, so the purpose of the P is so that the beneficiary of that status uh, can do entertaining in the US, but it must be or to participate in competitions or performances, tours, events, things of that nature.
So how is that purpose defined?
So, a competition, event, or performance basically just means an activity such as an athletic competition or season, a tournament, tour, exhibit, or entertainment event or engagement.
Yes, when you look at athletes, it can literally be for one tournament. I mean, it can be something like to compete in the Olympics if, when they're held in the United States. It can be for a season, obviously, if you're coming to play for a professional sports league, it can be a season. A lot of artists and entertainers, it's usually more tied to, well, it could be as little as a specific event or bigger, like a full tour. Um, the important thing is that you're able to define it. The thing that USCIS does not like is when you're just like, "Hey, I'm an amazing singer, and yeah, I want to come in and sing." And they're like, "Great. We need some like tour dates and locations and whatnot." Because that actually ties back to the next question: is well, how long can that purpose be?
So it's generally for the duration of a contract, especially with athletes. So if the league set down, figured out when the season was, when the games were going to be played, that contract's going to define how long those individuals can come over on the P.
Yeah, so I mean, usually what we tend to see is everything from just a couple of weeks, if it's like one event or something, all the way up to usually like a year, if it's based on a full season and they want you to come back and reapply every season. That's typically what you tend to see is that range in there. Um, so if it's kind of coming back to the contract, what type of details are they looking for as they pertain to the event?
So, I mean, first, it obviously has to describe the services to be performed. So, exactly what are they doing? Specify the wages that are going to be paid, the number of hours, working conditions, and any fringe benefits that those individuals are going to get.
Of course, we keep coming back to details, details, details are very important to USCIS. So, moving on, who can serve as the sponsor or the petitioner for a P visa?
So it kind of depends. So for the P1, a petition may be filed by a U.S. sponsoring organization, a U.S. agent, or a foreign employer through a U.S. agent. With the P2, it can be filed by a U.S. employer, a U.S. labor organization, which has negotiated the reciprocal exchange agreement, uh, or a sponsoring organization. And then finally, the P3 can be filed with a U.S. employer or the sponsoring organization.
So, obviously, there's some that are pretty straightforward. Like, hey, the Dallas Mavericks want to bring me in as their next starting forward. I mean, in my dreams. But anyway, obviously, in that case, the Dallas Mavericks, the employer, would be the direct sponsor. But you start thinking about like artists that have a tour. I mean, there's no one direct sponsor. I mean, maybe if it's like the record label could be the direct sponsor, but a lot of times in those cases, it mentions an agent doing it through a U.S. agent. So that kind of next question is, can you potentially have multiple employers if you're here on a P?
Yes, but each of those employers has to file a separate petitioner unless the petitioner is an agent on behalf of multiple employers. So, if you've got, say, multiple venues that are trying to work together on a concert tour, potentially they just all work with the one agent to set it all up.
Yes, let's delve a little bit into the agent because that for the Ps, again, when you're talking about sports leagues, those tend to be through the team, like there's a direct employer sponsor. But everything else, including like individualized sports, like you look at like golfers or anything that's a very individualized sports. We've done a lot of um, O visas, which are kind of similar in terms of the agent relationship for people like in karate, taekwondo, MMA fighting. Um, so again, let's talk a little bit about how the agent works.
So the agent should be a representative of both the employers and the beneficiary. That petition must include complete itinerary of services or engagements, and then again details on dates of each service, the name and address of the actual employer, and the name and addresses of the establishment, venues, or location where the performance is going to occur.
So the way this works in practice is I designate an agent, to some U.S. person, like a citizen or a resident. I have a contract between me and them that basically says they're going to be my agent for immigration purposes. And then you would go out and ideally get contracts between either the agent or the beneficiary and the different places that they're going to be working or performing. So that would be like a contract of all the different venues if you're a performer. Or or whatever it may be. Um, so the agent is just a really normal thing that we see all the time. And again, these are never like professional agents who are in the business of being an agent. The only time we ever see those is usually when it's related to like acting and modeling. Um, for just about everyone else, it's just someone that they've designated to serve as their agent, and then we put all these contracts and get together and stuff to make it work. So again, usually what we see is either it's an employer or it's an agent on behalf of multiple employers or an agent on behalf of a foreign employer. Tend to be the most common scenarios. So moving on, let's delve into some of the specific P's, starting with the P1, which we said was for athletes and entertainers, but we're going to start first with P1 athletes. Uh, so what is a P1 athlete?
So there's a lot of different definitions that go into this, but the first one would be someone who performs as an athlete individually or as part of a group team at an internationally recognized level of performance.
Okay, so we have an individual athlete or someone who's part of a team, but the key here is um, internationally recognized. So how do we define that?
For that, it must be an athlete coming to the United States to participate in an athletic competition which has a distinguished reputation and which requires participation of an athlete or athletic team that has an international reputation.
So again, you're kind of looking at the level of the thing that they're going to be competing in. So if it's like, oh, hey, I'm going to be competing in, some charity golf tournament, as opposed to, competing in a PGA Tour event, something that is itself internationally recognized and requires internationally recognized athletes. So they are looking at the sort of nature of the competition. So what's our second type of P1 athlete?
Simply one who's employed by a sports team.
Well, I can imagine there's a lot of different levels of sports teams out there. So how do you qualify as a sports team?
In this case, that's a team that has a member. A team that is a member of an association of six or more professional sports team with a total combined revenue that exceeds 10 million per year, or any minor league team that is affiliated with that kind of association.
So your league has to have at least six teams and collectively make more than $10 million a year. And believe me, we've worked on this specific type of case before, and they are very strict on this in terms of uh, potentially each team having to produce tax returns to prove that collectively they get to 10 million. Been down that road before, or any minor league team, right? So if you're like, you know, if you're in the G League for the NBA, or if you're like on a AAA team, that could potentially qualify for a P. Obviously, if you're in the MLB or the NBA itself, we're probably looking at an O visa for extraordinary ability, for those type of people that make it to that level. But again, if you're like in the G League, the summer league, or like the AAA type thing, then you're looking more at the P. Um, so what's the third type of P1 athlete?
So this would be someone who performs as an athlete or a coach, is part of a team or a franchise that is located in the U.S., and a member of a foreign league or association of 15 or more amateur sports teams.
So this is where you start kind of looking at like the NCAA, potentially kind of coming into play here under this criteria. One thing I'm going to point out is that this is the first time we've seen the word or coach listed. So typically under your like the first two definitions of a P1 athlete, coaches don't count as someone who would qualify. But here under this third one, it includes athletes and coaches. And well, there's one more, I think, right? One more. Yeah. What's the fourth one?
Yeah, so last is a professional or amateur athlete who performs either individually or as part of a group in a theatrical ice skating production.
So Disney on Ice, baby. They somehow got their own exception written into the rules here. They are considered P1 athletes. Um, so as previously mentioned, coaches generally don't qualify for P1. There is that one exception under number three. That was actually kind of written in later under something called well, I'm going to read it out here. Creating opportunities for minor league professionals, entertainers, and teams through legal entry, the Compete Act. So they got their own little write-in later. We're going to talk about that down the road because it is possible to do essential personnel to support the P principle, and that's where sometimes you can include coaches. But like a standalone coach typically doesn't fall under three of the four definitions of P1 athlete. Um, so one of the other key points is proving that the athlete has international recognition. And so, what are some potential ways by which we can prove international recognition?
So there's seven. So first would be significant participation in a prior season with a major U.S. sports league. Then we have participation in international competitions with the national team. So, playing for Team USA, Team Mexico. Three, significant participation in a prior season for a U.S. college or university intercollegiate competition. It's basically getting your start as a college athlete. Then we have a statement of international recognition of the beneficiary or team by governing body or official of the sport. Five is a statement of international recognition from sports media or recognized sport event. International ranking, and then finally, a significant honor or award.
So the P is, what we'd say is kind of a lower level. It's like, oh, I was, on, the University of Alabama volleyball team, and now I'm going to be playing in this pro league. I can apply for the P based on that. That's kind of, sort of the entry level. If you're looking at this list of seven and you're seeing somebody that hits multiple points, then you're probably looking at an O visa at that point. They're like, oh, they have an international ranking. They've competed on their national team. They were in the NCAA. They received awards and honors. You start seeing people hit multiple points here, then you may start thinking about the O visa for extraordinary ability. Those are the people at the very top of their fields. This is more for the people who like only hit one of these things because they're probably still fairly early on in their career. Those would be the P1 athletes, like potentially someone who played in college and maybe like just got drafted. Whereas if you're looking at like Giannis or Luca, guys like that, they're O's all day, right? Because they're already established themselves in the pro league, um, as top players. All right, so moving on. There's also the P1 entertainment group, a whole other subcategory. So what is this? What is an entertainment group?
So it's got to be two or more persons. So one guy can't be a group. And then it has to be established as one entity or one unit and provide services uh, or, sorry, and be a member group or someone, persons performing is an entertainment group.
So, what are the qualifications to be an entertainment group? I think some of this has to do with how long have they been together, or there's multiple members. Sometimes people come and go. So, what are the qualifications there?
So first they have to be established for a minimum of 1 year. 75% of the total group must have had a sustained and substantial relationship with the group by performing entertainment services for the group for a minimum of 1 year and under the same name is shown on the petition. So if
So,
your
for
group starts to shift members and change names, then you would start running into difficulties.
well, as an example, we're the very early Beatles, where they're performing in Germany, and they've been performing for less than a year, right? Well, they don't qualify because you have to hit a year. But let's say they hit a year and then they swap drummers, which they did, and they got Ringo Starr. Say, well, three of the four are still the same. That's 75%. So even though they just swapped out their drummer, they still would have qualified because enough people were still there from the original group. Otherwise, if you're like swapping out, like, hey, I'm the lead singer, I get in a fight with the whole rest of the group, I kick them all out and bring in a whole new guitarist, new drummer, and all that. Well, then you're going to have to wait a year in order to apply because 75% of the group hasn't been together for a year in that case. So that we are looking at how many members are there, how long have they been, and how long have those members been a part of the group. Um, Now, this is kind of at the time you're applying. There is kind of an exception if you've actually already gotten the P and then you need to substitute somebody. Usually, like if there's an injury or an illness, then you are able to substitute beneficiaries in that case. But that's after you've been approved. And again, that's usually if someone gets hurt or sick and can't perform. Um, so in the entertainment group, kind of like the athlete, you have to prove international recognition. So what are some of the avenues to prove international recognition?
So first you have evidence that the group has performed and will perform as a starring or leading entertainment group in a production or event that has a distinguished reputation. So, being the frontliner at a major concert. Then you have evidence that the group has achieved international recognition and acclaim for outstanding achievement. So, publication really showing that they're, have that reputation. Then there's evidence that the group has performed and will continue to perform services starring or leading for an organization and establishments that have distinguished reputation, is documented by articles and newspapers and so on. Um, Evidence that the group has a record of major commercial or critically acclaimed success, evidence of significant recognition or achievement from organization, critics, government agencies, or other experts. And then finally, evidence that the group has either commanded a high salary or will command a high salary, or other substantial remuneration, so ticket sales.
So again, we're looking at these six criteria. You typically need to be able to show at least three of the six. Um, so again, it's about, have you been a lead in something, with a distinguished reputation? So not looking at just were you the lead, but were that thing you performing in, did it have its own distinguished reputation? So it's just like, well, we were the lead at this concert that no one's ever heard of that was played in the backwoods of nowhere and no one went. It's like, well, it doesn't have distinguished reputation. But yeah, and then start looking at, awards and recognition. You start looking at, major media. Have they been sort of written about, talked about, high salary, all these factors, we put them together, see how many we can prove. Um, Ideally we prove three. And that shows sufficient international recognition for an entertainment group. So think of this as just like any type of band, but it can also apply to other things. Actually, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Um, anyway, jumping on away from the P1, we're going to jump to the P2, artists and entertainers and reciprocal exchange programs. What is this?
So this is for a national or a group to perform under something called a reciprocal exchange program. And the cool thing about this is it does not require exceptional ability.
But it is extremely limited. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, other than to name the exchange programs because there are only four.
Yeah, so first we have the American Foundation of Musicians in the United States and the American Foundation of Musicians in Canada. Then we have the Actors Equity Association in the United States and the Canadian Actors Equity Association in Canada. The Actors Equity Association in the United States and the British Actors Equity Association in the UK. And finally, the International Council of Air Shows and the Canadian Air Show Association.
So basically, you have to be a Canadian musician, Canadian actor, British actor, or Canadian pilot. That's right now. Obviously, this list hypothetically could expand and contract, but that's what it is right now. So it's extremely limited. And so we're going to move on. But hey, look, if you qualify for one of these, great. But we're going to go to the culturally unique P3 artists and entertainers. So, what is a P3 visa?
So this is available for artists, entertainers, or entertainment groups who will perform, teach, or coach under a commercial or non-commercial program that is culturally unique.
Culturally unique. That sounds ambiguous, but how is it defined?
So it's defined as a style of artistic expression, methodology, or medium which is unique to a particular country, nation, society, class, ethnicity, religion, tribe, or other groups of persons.
I have done these before, and it's not easy in terms of proving cultural uniqueness. You have to sometimes get letters from experts, and just you have to put a lot of documentation together to prove this. And I can give an example based on my experience having lived for a number of years in South America, specifically in Argentina, um, where actually one of the questions is first going to ask: is performing in a foreign language culturally unique?
So merely performing in a foreign language or native dialect, it just isn't sufficient to establish cultural uniqueness. Uh, Basically, the argument is if this was accepted, then all foreign singers who perform in their native language would qualify as culturally unique performers.
So I'm going to go back to the example from my life. If it's say I'm an Argentine pop singer or rock singer, right? They're going to say that's not culturally unique, even though you sing in Spanish. You're probably going to have to qualify under the P1 entertainer. But let's say you are some heavily involved in tango, which is a big sort of cultural thing in Argentina. Or another one that I saw a lot of living in the interior of the country is the sort of cross between a folklore, which is a sort of musical style, I would say most akin to like our country music, um, where it intersects with like gauchos and that whole culture there. And there's a lot of dances and stuff related to that. So you can see where it's like, oh, I'm an Argentine pop singer versus I'm an Argentine folklore singer, and like one being having to be a P1 entertainer, and the other one could potentially be a P3. Another example, Andrew, have you ever heard of river dance?
Yes.
Okay, I actually saw this as a kid. My parents took me kicking and screaming. It actually ended up being cooler than I thought. Um, but you look at river dance, when it first started, no one ever heard of it, probably would have qualified as a P3, right? Because this thing is very Irish in terms of the music and the dance. I mean, everything about it is very Irish. So when it first started, it was probably a P3. But then once all of a sudden it became, pretty well known and famous, all of a sudden it kind of transitions into like a P1, to the point where like the head guy, he himself probably could have gotten an O1 eventually. But you can kind of see where you can kind of start as a P3, and if it actually has a lot of success, it could kind of move into to P1, but back and forth. So again, needs to be not just in a foreign language, but culturally unique. Something very specific in terms of like music or dance or whatever, to the culture. So moving on, we're going to talk about some of the supporting evidence that you need in pretty much all P cases, sort of core pieces of evidence. So Andrew, what are those?
So there's four. So first we have evidence appropriate to the particular P classification. So one, two, or three. Copies of any written contracts between the petitioner and beneficiary. Number three, an explanation of the nature of the events or activities, the beginning and end dates for the events, and a copy of any itinerary for these events. And finally, an advisory opinion from a labor organization.
So again, it comes down to details, details, details. They want those contracts between the petitioner and the beneficiary, and if the petitioner is an agent, the all the other employers are sort of the end client or user. Itinerary, itinerary, itinerary. Man, they want to know with as much detail as you can provide. And sometimes you'll see, people who, for example, some of these athletes we were doing that were competing in various events over the next year, they had very specific dates, but getting into like year two and year three, the dates were a little bit more like, well, this event tends to happen in February. That's usually been okay. Where you don't maybe have a specific date and out in later years, but at least in that first year, it needs to be uh, reasonably precise. Again, unless it's like a sports season, and then of course that's a little bit different. Where you can just say, hey, the NFL, we start training, in the summer, and then the season starts, in September, and then it, ends, depending how far you go, all the way into February. Um, Last one you said is an advisory opinion. So, what is an advisory opinion?
So, first off, written advisory opinion is mandatory. It comes from a labor organization with expertise in that specific field of athletics or entertainment, and addresses the nature of the work to be done and the alien's qualifications.
So, just like for O's, this is mandatory for P's. If you look it up, USCIS has a list of these different labor organizations. It's not like all encompassing, but there is a list there. And it's a lot of like, the Screen Actors Guild and a lot of stuff like that. And if whatever you're doing, and again, for most Ps, this is going to apply. Again, the NBA has a labor union, the MLB has a labor union. most things related to acting and singing have labor unions. Um, so for the O's, we do certain things like for entrepreneurs and stuff where there is no labor union, so you're able to sort of state as much. You don't need it, but where there is a labor union, you have to have this no matter what. And for P's, it's pretty much going to apply 100% of the time. So you have to reach out to that organization. They're used to doing this. They usually have someone who's in charge of it. They usually charge a fee. So usually what ends up happening is you reach out to them and they say, "Hey, send us all this documentation." Usually is they just want to see a full draft of what you're going to submit, all the forms, support letter, table of contents. They might want to see the supporting docs too, but usually they want to see a full draft. You send it to them. Take a couple weeks to look at it. You have to pay them a fee. You can also pay them an expedite fee, and then you give them. They give you a letter, and ideally the letter says, "We reviewed the thing. We think this person, qualifies, and we have no objection." Um, Sometimes they don't talk about your qualifications. They just say, "We have no objection, whatever, we'll take it." Um, but the written advisory opinion is mandatory and it's going to apply to most P cases. Again, sometimes there's not, like we did a venture capitalist, there's not a labor organization for venture capitalists. Sounds not like something they would do. Okay, so moving on, we already kind of mentioned this before, but Andrew then asked the question, can a P bring in support personnel?
Yes, so they can be accompanied and assisted by essential support personnel.
So, well, essential's been an interesting word to define during the pandemic in terms of who is qualified and not qualified as essential. Um, how do we define essential for P support personnel?
In this case, it's a highly skilled, essential person determined by USCIS to be an integral part of the performance of the P beneficiary because because they perform support services which cannot be readily performed by a US worker and which are essential to the successful performance by the P beneficiary.
So, how about some examples for like a P1 athlete? What's an example of essential support personnel?
So essential support personnel for an athlete would include people like the coaches, trainers, scouts, managers, folks of that nature.
And then what about for like the entertainment groups? What would be essential support personnel?
So like the technicians, the sound engineers, the group's manager, folks like that.
Yeah, I mean, we had one we were looking at recently for a golfer, and they brought in their manager, so support personnel. But with the entertainment groups, you're looking at a lot of like the sound techs, or if it's some type of play, people with costumes and set and stuff. I mean, sometimes the essential support personnel can be more than the um, actual P1 people, depending on the nature of the group. Um, so when I file a petition, do I include the P1 principals and the essential support personnel kind of in one, or do I have to do them separately?
So for the essential support personnel, you do have to submit separate petitions for the initial P beneficiary and then the P essential support personnel.
Well, Andrew, I think I'm a culturally unique singer. So how would I go about getting me this P visa? Do I just run over to the nearest embassy and apply for the visa?
No, so first you have to file with USCIS.
And how long does that take?
Several months, but there is premium processing again for the low price of $2,500.
Yeah. Now, the one good thing about P's is of all of the visa non-immigrant visas you can submit to USCIS, it's actually the fastest when in regards to regular processing. Um, it's very realistic to see P's specifically come back in under a month. Because so they're so often related to a specific like season and whatnot. So USCIS just tends to process them faster, but premium processing is available. Um, So obviously, if I'm in the United States in another status, I could potentially request a change of status outside of the US, or if I need to travel. Once it's approved, I go and apply for the visa. So let's say USCIS approves it and I want to go apply for the visa. How far in advance of my start date can I apply for the visa?
To actually apply for the visa, you can do that up to 90 days before the start.
And then I have the visa. How early can I enter the United States before my start date? So, let's say I'm a football player and I got my P1 to come in and training camp starts on, I don't know, July 15th. Uh, and that's kind of the start date of my P. How so I can get it 90 days, I can get the visa 90 days in advance, but how early can I actually enter the US?
10 days before the start date. So you can set yourself up to come get settled in or set up at your location 10 days before you actually start.
And last question. Um, hey, if I'm a P1 athlete or any P in general, can I bring in my spouse and children?
Uh, Generally, I want to say yes.
Yeah, so you can generally bring in spouse and children on a P4. Would be spouse and children. Um, Another question I'm going to throw out there, see if we can stump Andrew. I know I didn't put this down, but is there a lifetime maximum for P status?
Not that I know of. Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, I knew we'd stump you with one. I deliberately left it off. Um, so actually, for P leagues, there is a limitation of 10 years. So they can potentially get like a 5 years and then another 5 years on fleets, limited to 10 years. So I'm kind of looking at that and saying, well, you better get good and get to a place where you can apply for the O. Otherwise, I guess if you just kind of sit in the minor leagues forever, you could hit uh, a ceiling, or hit a wall on the P. Anyway, P is really interesting. Um, there's a lot of just these little nuances to it, especially based on the case, where whether it's like, are you part of a team? Are you an individual? Is it a pro league, an amateur league? I mean, there's a lot of different variables that can go in that we have to look at. But we have done Ps for athletes, P1s for athletes and entertainment groups. We have done P3s for culturally unique groups. These are sort of interesting and fun categories to work with. Uh, Andrew, any final comments on the P visas?
No, I think we hit the highlights.
Awesome. Well, hey, look, if you have any questions, you can go to our website where you can email us, you can call us, go to the website, you can self book a consultation if you have any further questions you want to follow up. Also, look for our app, Lawpilot GUARDIAN. You can get it pretty much anywhere. Download it onto your phone for free. There's a lot of useful information in there. Um, and also, we're just every day integrating more and more stuff into the app. So, thank you for tuning in. Keep looking forward as we keep moving through all the non-immigrant visas and eventually residency categories. We're going to keep adding more information, trying to be your sort of number one resource for everything employment-based immigration related. But Andrew, thanks for your help today,
Anytime.
and we will see you later.